Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 Wilderness Speaker Series. I'm Bill Hodge, happy to play host for you again here on our second in our series here in 2021. For those of you who don't know, the Wilderness Speaker Series is a collaboration between the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation, the Flathead-Kootenai chapter of the Montana Wilderness Association, the Northwest Montana Lookout Association, and the Natural Resources Conservation Management Program at Flathead Valley Community College. It's a long-term partnership that has really been great for all of the organizations that work to put this on. Obviously, 2021 has been a little bit different in that we're gathering here virtually on our screens and not in person at the college, but we do think it's been exciting that we've been able to reach a new and different audience by being in a virtual format. This is the second, as I said, of our installment in 2021. Our first was last month with Dr. Drew Lanham. If you missed that one and you'd be interested in that one that really explored the intersection of race and conservation, that is available on the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation website at bmwf.org. While you're at the website, you can also purchase tickets right now for our Mountain Film Festival, which is virtual, and will launch next Thursday. And you'll have a 4-day weekend starting Thursday and go until the following Sunday. So those tickets are available now, but you can check out the last Wilderness Speaker Series, and we will be recording tonight's. So if for some reason you don't get to stick around for the whole thing and you want to capture all of it, about 24 hours after we complete this conversation, we'll be able to have it up on the website, and you'll be able to find it again on the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation website. A little bit of housekeeping issues for tonight. We are going to be taking questions. If you move your cursor, move your mouse, you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, you have a Q&A box, and that would be the best place for you to put your questions. I'll monitor that tonight and try to pull out questions and present them to John, our speaker tonight, as we go along, or save some of them for a Q&A at the end. You can use the chat box as well, but really the Q&A box is the way to put your questions in so that we can make sure we pass those along. We'll try to get to them as many as we can. And some of them will probably be sort of merged into one question. So, but glad you all could join us tonight. Right now, I'd like to introduce tonight's presenting sponsor for this tonight, and my friend Shel.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Shel Peterson. I'm here repping the Northwest Montana Lookout Association. For those of you who don't know us, we're an all-volunteer 501c3, and we hatched in 2013. Our basic mission is to support state and federal agencies in restoration and maintenance of historic fire detection lookouts. And we're currently partnering with the state of Montana, Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, Glacier National Park, Flathead National Forest, and the Kootenai National Forest. And if you are not familiar with us and want to join us or become part of us, you can easily Google Northwest Montana Lookouts, and our website will pop up. And we also, like Bill mentioned, we'll have a recording of all of the Wilderness Speaker Series events on our website, so you can follow up that way also. Tonight, we're excited to welcome John McCarthy. He's the author of Working the Wilderness, Early Leaders for Wildlands, who's joining us from Boise. And since Bill and John have worked together in the past, I'm going to toss this back to you, Bill, to introduce John.
Yeah, thanks, Shel. Thanks for finding it. I was so excited when you sent along that John was your all speaker. John and I shared a career for a little bit. We were both at the Wilderness Society at the same time. We were 2,500 miles apart, so we didn't share an office, but we shared an organization. One thing I do know we share is a deep passion for wild places and the people who make it possible. And John has been awfully important in that effort, particularly in the state of Idaho. John, if I recall right, Idaho Conservation League in your history, as well as time at the Wilderness Society and a lot of time spent in the backcountry. So along with Shel, it is my great honor to introduce John McCarthy, who's going to talk about his wonderful book. Thanks for joining us, John.
Well, thanks, Bill, and thanks everybody for coming across the mountain and listening to what I have to say. And thanks, Jell, for tracking me down. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to some folks. This book came out in 2019, and I did a whole bunch of tours and talked to a lot of people, including coming over to the Bitterroot, but didn't make it to the Flathead. I'd hoped to, and then of course I didn't go anywhere in 2020. But I'm going to do sort of the same routine that I did when I was on the road. I've got what we used to call a slideshow. Now it's a PowerPoint, and it tells the story of the lead characters and sort of the story of the book. And I'm going to do the share screen thing here, and I think it takes 2 setups to do it. So we hit share screen. And let's see. It is working. Just want to make sure it advances. Yep, it does. Right? Could you see it advance, folks? Yep, okay. Well, let's start with a map. Always good to start with a map. The book takes place pretty much in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, and that was really the starting point for me. The Selway, of course, straddles the Montana-Idaho border. Some key places in the story is the Moose Creek Ranger Station there on the Selway River, the Powell Ranger Station up north along the Locksaw River, and Whitecap Creek, the Whitecap drainage down here next to Paradise Guard Station in the upper Selway. A lot of people may say that a single event changes their life. For me, flying into the Moose Creek Ranger Station, April 23rd, 1977, when I was age 26, changed my life. The ranger station is tucked back in the trees behind that plane and the windsocks. And I flew in April, stayed until December. But what really changed my life was meeting this man, Emil Keck. He's up on top of the Bear Creek Bridge Tower. You can see he's lifting up, he's getting ready to lift with the gin pole, pull the cables up to tear down the towers. Emil had all the skills and attitudes you needed in the wilderness. Self-reliance, ingenuity, perseverance, endurance, strength, and just being skilled at everything you needed to do. He's 30 feet up above the deck, another 25 feet up above the creek. No hard hat, no safety harness. He was just tough. And he was also part of a 2-person team, Penny and Emil Keck. They were my bosses. They ran the trail crew program. They were the only Forest Service people who lived in the wilderness all year round. They lived there all year round, just the 2 of them. And they were in charge of the maintenance and operations, all the buildings, the ranger stations, the scattered lookouts, the trails, the big ranger station at Moose Creek. But most of what they did on their own was rebuild the bridges. There's Bear Creek again. They lived in camps out through the winter. Their tools in the wall tent to the left where they lived was in the back there. This again is 1969. The gin poles are behind. That's to pull up to hold the cables while they replaced all the wood. Emil grew up on a stump farm in Western Washington, pulled a crosscut saw as a kid to make money, went on to be a logger, firefighter, moved to Idaho, running fire crews, came out to Moose Creek in 1963 before the Wilderness Act, and adapted his skills as a logger and moving big timbers to be able to repair and replace all the bridges. This bridge was first built in the 20s, then rebuilt by prisoners of war, Italian prisoners of war during World War II. And then in the 60s, they rebuilt it. Just the 2 of them, Emil and Penny. They're there with the forest supervisor telling them how it's going. Note there's no railings. They're replacing everything. Moose Creek was a pretty big operation when I was there. There was about 30 people working out of the ranger station. We had guard school, there'd be more than 30 people. Through the year, it was more like 24 people were there and working out of the station. People were scattered around other ranger stations in the district. Emil and Penny lived in a little board shack, but much of the time in the winter, they'd be out on a bridge site. They wouldn't be at the station. They were hardly ever at the station, even summer, winter, they were out on the land. They'd come back to the ranger station during the winter and shovel off the snow. They knew how to do everything, and they taught us how to do it. Penny grew up on a crop farm near Portland, Oregon, was excellent at all three sports, played sports in college, came to Moose Creek in 1967 as a fire lookout at Shistler Peak, said she couldn't really get along with the boss, but she liked him well enough to marry him and stayed with Emil. They were tough, they were strong, they were intense, they were great teachers. They both studied to be coaches in college. Emil thought he'd coach baseball. Penny wasn't sure whether it was going to be basketball or softball, but they ended up in the wilderness where they taught young people. This is about 1970, bunch of Sierra Club volunteers. Emil showing them how to run a crosscut saw. You can tell, back in those days, a bunch of hippies, and they were really pretty ill prepared to come out. Kid in the back there with the cotton shirt, blue jeans, got a Sierra Club cup. The kid in the middle there looking down, looks like maybe he's got a pipe in his hands. You just don't know about kids in those days. But Emil and Penny taught us young punks how to be out on the land, to learn the skills and how to just be there. So they were tough, they were intense, they were also incredibly funny, and they enjoyed their lives. They were glad to have the time when they were alone. They were glad to have the time when they got to teach people, when they got to visit with people, and they had a chance to be out there all different times a year. Chell, you had a story about when you met him in, I think it was in Orofino when you had a training program?
Yeah, John, I worked on the Clearwater National Forest for most of my career, and in the late 70s, I was coordinating a training session in Orofino, and as I was looking through the nomination forms, I just about spit my teeth out when I saw nominations from Emil and Penny, because I had heard all the stories. And even though I'd never met them in person, I had heard the stories, and I thought, what kind of disaster is this going to be? And so when they both showed up the first day of the training session, I was on high alert. What I discovered was that they were two of the kindest, nicest souls that you would ever want to sit down in a classroom with. So that's my perspective of the two of them.
We were both afraid of them, and we just laughed our butts off hearing their stories. Emil was one of the funniest guys on the planet. He was so irreverent, and to everybody, he didn't care who it was. Sometime on the side, I'll tell you a great story about what he asked Senator Warren, who was married to Elizabeth Taylor, when he asked a story about Elizabeth Taylor. But he was just one of the funniest guys and one of the hardest working guys. And he taught us about work. And we got to be there because, back in those days, it was two-person trail crews. And we take off two-person backpack trail crews out into this land. We cover 100 miles in a 10-day hitch, not all working the trail, but getting there to where we needed to go. 75-pound packs, carrying our tools. And we'd often, when we had a chance, because part of the territory that I covered was near where Emil and Penny were working at Three Links. So this is where they were for more than 3 years to replace the Three Links Bridge. 256 feet between the towers. It's the largest structure anywhere in the wilderness at that time. In the late 70s, they spent the 3 years. We'd stop off to hear stories. Maybe they'd feed us pancakes. They'd tell us about where to find water, what we were gonna find on the trails, but mostly we stopped off because we just wanted to see them. And we didn't get a chance that often, but we got to be out there in the land, all different kinds of weather. Throughout, I was there from April until December, working trails from May until October. And sometimes the weather was great. We'd get to go for a swim in the river. Often the weather was crummy. It was a great experience for a young person, and to have the masters who could tell us how to be there really made it work. So the Selway Bitter was one of the original wildernesses, 1964. It was the largest wilderness designated in 1964 at 1,092,000 acres, 30,000 acres bigger than the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And wilderness, as we know, was declared to protect the land, to preserve the land, but the land changes. And the land was shaped by fire back in the day, but of course we know that 1910 fires through Montana and through Idaho changed the attitude about having fire on the land. And the attitude of the Forest Service, really what got the Forest Service going, was to stop fire. But fire was part of the land, and the land was shaped by fire. Here's a picture with fire back on the land, because fire was reintroduced or allowed to burn or accepted first in the Selway Bitter in the early 1970s. This is a picture in 2016, almost 40 years after fire was put back on the land on purpose in the wilderness. You can see the burnt bowls, the snags. The left side of the picture, ponderosa pine, open. Right side of the picture, north-facing slope on the right side of the Selway. Used to be, when I was there, dense forest. Now, 40 years later, it's opened up. It's variable. There's old growth, there's openings, there's new, there's decaying trees. And fire got put back on the land intentionally, in large part because one guy. Oh, this is the picture I wanted to show this to show you. This is 1971. This is more what it looked like back when I was there, when it was all uniform and dense. The Moose Creek is right about in the middle of the picture there. Looking at Puzzle Point, the other picture, this picture is around the corner, but in looking also at a different part of the canyon where it's all variable and it's not uniform. Here, looking from Bailey Mountain, much more uniform. But fire was brought back onto the land in large part because of this guy, William R. Moore, known to everybody as Bud. Bud Moore was a mountain man. Bud Moore was a trapper, shown here with a marten pelt, later years. He was not a wilderness ranger, he was the forest ranger. He was a quintessential forest ranger. Grew up on the Bitterroot side, Lolo Creek. As a teenager, as in age 13, he headed out into the Loxaw country to run a trap line. He started working for the Forest Service in 1935 at age 17. He quit school in the 8th grade, never went past the 8th grade, but he worked his way up at age 17 as a fire lookout to a smoke chaser, worked his way up to be the district ranger at Powell Ranger Station, Powell Ranger District on the north side, and then continued to work his way up and became the director of fire and aviation for the Region 1 out of Missoula for both North Idaho and Western Montana. And Bud, along the way, was a great supporter of wilderness and another great teacher of young people wilderness skills. Here he is near Fish Lake in the early 70s. Behind him is Gary Kohler. You can't see that he's half Bud's age. Gary was a wilderness ranger and also a wildlife biologist. He was in his master's program at the University of Idaho to study marten and as a wildlife indicator species for forest ecology, wilderness ecology, wildland ecology. And Bud was teaching him how to live trap marten. No longer trap them for pelts, but trap them to put a radio collar on them. And Bud taught many people about being out in the wilderness all times a year. But in that time of being out in the wilderness, Bud snowshoeing and skiing, he thought himself, not as a trained scientist, but as a person who understood wildlife and wilderness from being on the ground. Bud thought about how habitat was shaped by fire. Fire was how habitat was shaped in the wilderness, as always has been and should be again. So who but a mountain man and the head of fire and aviation could really challenge the Forest Service commandment to always put fires out by 10 a.m. 1910, people were spooked about fire. And for the next 60 years, people tried to put out every fire. Bud pushed to have fire back on the land, but he was methodical about it. And he put together a study team for 2 years in the White Cat Creek drainage, 66,000 acres in the Upper Selway, to study fire history, fuels, study the land and how fire affected the land. And this was before there was even anything at the universities, like at the University of Montana, University of Idaho, that they even considered as fire ecology. The term wasn't even there, but Bud pushed to have fire back on the land, had a team studying the land to manage fire and monitor fire, not just to let it rip, but to see when and how it can burn in a way that's safe and beneficial for the land. In late 1972, they got approval to have the first fire tested, to get the experiment put out onto the ground. The chief of the Forest Service said, okay, let's see what happens. The first lightning strike in the fire area burnt out, so they didn't get a good fire going at all in that first year. But the next year, August 1973, they got a hot strike in Fitz Creek. And here's the spot fire, several spot fires moving up towards Bad Luck Lookout in Fitz Creek in the White Cat Creek drainage. It's the first significant fire the Forest Service allowed to burn in the wilderness, the first time they've had a fire. And when the flames got close to the lookout, those flames kicked up and they got close to the lookout, and Bud agreed to call in a retardant drop and to knock back the flames. They didn't really want to have the Bad Luck Lookout burn out in the first so-called managed fire. Wasn't going to go for good for immediate slow time in August. And you can see the little outhouse there to the left. It almost got knocked over by the retardant drop, and did get knocked over when the Huey helicopter came by to see how the retardant drop worked. So of course there was lots of jokes about the contents of the outhouse going up and hitting the helicopter blades, as in the shit hitting the fan. So this was the very first. This was the beginning. Dick Walker took the picture flying by, the very first picture of fire back in the wilderness, intentional. In the book, I followed Laura Mae Jackson up on top of Shistler Peak and how her life changed with fire back on the land, where she's no longer just spotting fires, but she's monitoring fires, and she's part of the whole communication system to see how fires move and how the fires can be safe and yet still effective to be out there changing the land. And she talked to me about how another crazy time was when the fire hit Puzzle Point heading towards Moose Creek. You can see, I think the circle thing is working, but that's the end of the airstrip. The fire could have blown towards Moose Creek. They were protecting the bridges. They were protecting the ranger station. Laura Mae from 5 miles away up on top of Shistler's could hear trees igniting, cracking, falling. The fire roared through the night, but they allowed it to continue to burn. It was a little bit much to catch at that point. So for you lookouts, I just threw a couple of pictures in of Wiley's Peak, the flagship of lookouts. Emil and Penny intended to jack up the tower the little lookout, replaced the rotten sills. They never got to it before they left, and fire took out the lookout. Fire turned it into ashes when the lightning strike hit in the early 90s. Wiley's is no longer there. But this team that Bud put together included Bob Much on the left, Dave Altertz in the middle, Bud with the hat, can't really see him. They're here at Whitecap Creek. And the guy without much hair is a man named Bill Wharf. The Whitecap Five, as they called themselves, the people who really led this program to get fire back on the land, also included Orville Daniels, who was the forest supervisor in the Bitterroot at the time. But Bill Wharf was the head of Recreation and Lands for Region 1 out of Missoula, and he was also one of the only higher-ups in the Forest Service who thought fire was a good idea back in the land because it fit the spirit of wilderness, it fit the law of wilderness, and it was the right thing to do. Here's Wharf at his house in later years in the Bitterroot Valley. And Wharf was a forest supervisor at the Bridger in Wyoming at the time of the Wilderness Act 1964. He was sent back with a handful of guys back to Washington, D.C., to the Washington office to write the manual on how to administer the new wilderness under the Wilderness Act, and what were the regulations for both the agency and for the public? How should people be on the land in the new wilderness? And Wharf thought it was going to be an easy thing. But when they got back there, they realized that they all had different ideas of what wilderness was about. They realized that the Wilderness Act, as short and succinct as it was, still needed a lot of thought to change not only operations, but to change attitudes. And Wharf grew up on a farm, a ranch in eastern Montana. He was mild-mannered, but he had a steadfast practicality and a steadfast will. And his idea of wilderness was that it was a strong set of guidance that brought us back to treatment of the land, really the way it was in the 1800s. And it was to connect us with the American history and to connect us with the American ideal of pioneers and experience in the land. And one of the ideas of the Wilderness Act was to limit human imprint and human intrusions. So when he came back out west, he pushed to eliminate the signs of past constructions and intrusions from both campers and from the agency. Here's Charlie Gindler, the packer at Moose Creek. He's loading garbage, abandoned gear, and the number 9 wire used for all the Forest Service lookout towers thread through the ranger stations. One of Wharf's ideas and the thing he pushed hard for was to get the wilderness rangers out on the ground, tearing down the old junk, packing it up, rolling it out, climbing the trees, pulling the insulators, doing the work to naturalize the land and to eliminate as best they could the signs of human intrusions. This is Tim Rich up on a ponderosa pine, pulling insulators. As some of us know, those insulators were all over the place and hard to find. You can still see a few of them out there, but with the new radios, the telephone system was no longer needed. So packing out junk and rolling up wire wasn't real glamorous for a wilderness ranger or for a packer, but it was the right thing to do. And Wharf was one of the strong people to push for changes. He also believed in traditional tools and traditional skills. You notice in the back there behind Dale Swee is the handles of a crosscut saw draped over the horse. And here along with the wire on the horse on the right is another crosscut saw draped over the horse. I'm going to get back to the crosscut saw, but one more thing on Bill Wharf. When he retired from the Forest Service, he wanted to support continued interest in having traditional skills put back on the land. He wanted to continue the interest in seeing the land as natural as possible. He created a group called Wilderness Watch out of some folks in Missoula and him got together and started this thing called Wilderness Watch. And he thought of it as a way to support the Forest Service to do the right thing and to do the work that needed to be done. And he found that he needed to push them hard, and he needed to convince them, and sometimes lobby them, and sometimes sue them to get the work done. In the mid-'80s, the Forest Service was going to do a sampling of lakes for acid rain study that was being done, and they were going to fly helicopters into all the lakes, including in Wilderness. Worf and Wilderness Watch convinced the Forest Service through his personal connections that he still had within the Forest Service to do it on the ground in Wilderness. So here's Dale on the right and Ralph on the left, out there at May Lake near Bailey Mountain, pretty high elevation, collecting in early spring before the lakes turned over. And in Wilderness, they did do it on the ground because of Bill Worf. Wilderness Watch continues today. It's sometimes not so cooperative. It's sometimes kind of antagonistic towards the Forest Service and the other agencies, but they're trying to push them to follow the wilderness. Did you, Joe, did you know Worf?
I did not know Worf, but I do have a story on Bud Moore when you have a chance.
Oh, that's right. It was Bud. That's right. Well, tell me your Bud story.
Okay, we'll jump back to Bud for a bit. I never met the man personally, but when I left the adult world and retired from the Forest Service and moved to the Flathead, I went back 5 autumns in a row and staffed Beaver Ridge Lookout late in the season. And I don't know how many people recognized it at that point. I sort of knew it, but we were already getting into climate change at that point. And fire season started earlier and they lasted later. So I had five seasons that I got to do late staffing at Beaver Ridge. While I was up there, I can't remember if it was the first or second year, but Bud's book, The Lookout, the Loxall story came out, and I was lucky enough to get a copy of that. And you can imagine sitting right on the edge of the Selway Wilderness, reading that book was kind of a spiritual thing. Well, anyway, it sort of got me into a poetic mood, and I authored a poem while I was up there, which I called Ancient Spirits. And I used some ideas out of Bud's book. So at one point, after I'd read the book, I sent it to him and asked him for an inscription, which he graciously provided, a nice and handwritten inscription. And I sent him a copy of Ancient Spirits to ask him permission, if I got the opportunity to publish it, whether he minded if I used the poem that had a lot of his ideas and thoughts in it. He wrote me back a personal letter, which is taped on the inside of my book and signed by him, that I was more than welcome to use his ideas in my poem. And he then said that he was going to frame my poem and hang it in his cabin, which I thought was pretty cool. So that's my spiritual connection to Bud Moore.
His book is still available. His book is still, it's still out. It's a great, great read. It's one of the best histories of the Forest Service through that whole time of fighting fires and how things changed. And while he was at Powell, the logging massively expanded when they punched the road through. He was at Powell when they punched the road through up the Loxaw. And he writes about the changes in the Forest Service. Bud's book is one of the best. He was an amazing character. He passed away, I don't remember the exact year. I think it was 2012. I think it was 92. He continued to be a trapper into his 80s. Well, back to my story here. So here's Ralph and Dale camped out early spring. If Emil and Penny taught the skills and Bill Wharf was the guy to push for traditional skills, Warren Q. Miller was the guy who really made the tool work. Warren, in addition, he was a wilderness ranger at Moose Creek. In addition to wanting to be out on the ground doing things, he wanted to understand how things worked. He'd studied physics in college. He understood metal, and he wanted to know, with crosscut saws, how they worked, why they worked, how teeth and raker fixed, how the flex fixed. He wanted to understand how it cut and why it cut. So when the crosscuts after 1964, once the chainsaw was taken off, crosscuts were pulled out of the dustbins of history, out of the basements, out of the old tool sheds. And Warren figured out how to clean them up, how to sharpen them, how to take out the bends, and how to teach people how to use them. He was not just a saw filer, he was a saw preserver. And he rewrote the manual that was first written in the 20s, in 1977. He rewrote the manual on how to file saws. It's still available in a PDF. It's no longer in print, but it was in print for many, many years. You can still find a copy kicking around. He filed saws for more than 20 years at Moose Creek in a little shed. He filed for the district. He filed for smoke jumpers. He filed for other districts. But what really expanded the use was he taught people through the manual, and then later on. But here's his little saw shed at Moose Creek. In the spring and the fall, before and after his season as a wilderness ranger, he'd be out there in his little saw shed filing saws, fixing saws. He had hundreds of saws hanging up. People would bring him saws from all over the place. But after a disagreement with the district ranger in 1990, after 20 years, the district ranger wanted to move him into town and no longer be out of Moose Creek. District ranger wanted to move him into town. Warren said he wasn't really willing to do that. So he quit the Forest Service, but he continued to file saws and teach saw filing. This is from a DVD that is still available. Well, it was first as a video and still available as a DVD, a really fine little DVD on how to file saws and how to fix them and why and what the system is. This is unfortunately late in the game for Warren. He died at age 69 in I think it was memory 2014, but he left behind his DVD. And he also left behind a whole sense of why and how to use crosscut saw. And the crosscut saw fits both the spirit of the wilderness and the law of the wilderness. And it's still being used today. Here's Jenny and Danny in 2016 in the brand new, what's now we call the Cecil D. Andrus Wilderness, the Boulder White Cloud Wilderness, just declared then, signed into law by President Obama. They're out there learning the ways of the wilderness. This was a project from the Idaho Trails Association and my old outfit, the Idaho Conservation League. They're both staff for Idaho Conservation League. ICL got into this part of the game a little bit late. Bill Wharf had told me how Montana Wilderness Association was really a leader in being involved with wilderness management. We called it then, now we call it wilderness stewardship. MWA stayed with wilderness management beyond designation. Of course, MWA also has ACE service projects and ACE trail projects. ICL was a little slow, but they now have good service projects, and we all along tried to emulate MWA's great hiking program, the public hiking program. So hats off to MWA for leading the way on that one. Here's another pair, Eva and Diane. This is the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church Foundation in the Frank Church Wilderness in 2014. The Selway Bitterroot Foundation got its start in 2005, and another tip of the hat to the Bob Marshall Foundation. The Selway Frank Foundation really used the Bob Marshall Foundation as a model for engagement and how to bring people in. Here's another action shot. Linda single bucking a giant Doug fir. This is another ITA project, Idaho Trails project in the Hells Canyon wilderness. Took us hours to cut and roll that log. Here's Eric and Zach, another Selway Frank project in the Frank, different project, different time. Here's me, kind of an old timer now, but every year since 2009, I've led or co-led one of these projects, and it's always a great experience for all the participants. And we get a lot of work done, even as volunteers. We used to laugh about volunteers back in the old days when we were young punks, but we got to have volunteers these days, and we're doing a lot of really good work out there. This again is in Hells Canyon. And we got a lot of people hauling tools in and doing this tough work, and we need a lot more. With fire, there's a lot of trees coming down. But it's a great experience.
John,
Yeah.
John, I love this tribute to the crosscut saw. I mean, years ago, I started using the expression that the crosscut saw is the gateway drug to doing wilderness stewardship. It is the tool that everybody loves to be really proficient at. And I think about Warren, and I wonder, I don't wonder, I know how much his skills have influenced so many other people. I have legendary filers here on the Flathead and around the Bob, Fred Flint, who's longtime board chair of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation. I'm assuming at some point Dolly Chapman down in California learned from Warren, and she's still teaching crosscut filers across the country. It's just such a great collection of photos you've got there.
I meant to mention that he was one of the first at the Arthur Carhart Training Center there outside of Missoula, and he did it for a couple of weeks, couple times a year. I mean, he taught hundreds of people, and the people I've heard who've been to those saw filing trainings said that it wasn't just about how, it was about why, and that you could learn how to do it. And so many people have, and fixed up the saws. I got some more saw pictures, but also the morning stretch.
So John, I've got a question for you from the audience. John Clayton asked that says he's fascinated by the tension between working, quote, working, transforming, meaning transforming surroundings, and wilderness, the untrammeled character. Can you talk more about how people saw that dichotomy, the working in the wilderness, and in wilderness, a place where sort of work is not how we think about it?
Well, all these trails were put in by the Forest Service really to move firefighters around. And then and then they put some of the trails on top of the old Indian trails. In our territory, it was the Nez Perce Indians. And then of course, the hunters were the ones who really benefited from it, because they were the ones who really wanted to get around in the fall. And then other recreationists came in. And for me, the whole crux of it is, if we don't have trails, if we don't have bridges, people won't be able to get around, and they won't really appreciate the land, and they won't be able to see it. And so that sense of being able to be out on the land, it's really important to have at least a minimal trail system. And in this part of the country, there's a lot of trees. There's a lot of trees falling over now with fire, and it takes a lot of work to keep it going. When I was out there, we had 4 trail crews. One was a heavy construction crew. It was a crew of like 6 or 8. And then we had 3 traveling crews. We had 3 wilderness rangers. We had assistant wilderness rangers. We don't have that kind of staffing anymore. And it really takes a lot of attention to be able to keep a trail system going. And for me, just the act of being out there working the land connected me with the land. And I see that's the case with the young people, or the people of all ages that we bring out today. It's not, we go out for a hike for a week, or people are doing these long distance hikes now, but to be out there and stay and work gets you connected to the land in a different way. And that's a lot of what I'm trying to celebrate in this whole idea of being out on the land. So when you get into a log jam like this, it's like, wow, this is going to be a good day. We got some work to be done here. And now that you've got large volunteer crews, it enhances the work to be out here and to get the saws running and to get the axes swinging and to get the logs get the logs rolling. There's a different version of double bucking. I don't think in these four, I don't think that any one of them was over 30 years old. Now we got some old timers out there, but I mean, in this work, Kathy, a good friend here from Boise, she was afraid of an axe when she got there. She didn't know what she was doing. By the end of the week, she is swinging the axe, bumping knots. And it really changed her attitude about being out there. So that sense of working the land and helping people to be out there is a big part of the end of the book of what I'm trying to explain to people, why we need to be supportive of not just designating land, but caring for the land, being a part of the land, so that people can really experience it. And I mean, I am glorifying the crosscut. I mean, it's such a joy. Now that I am getting a little bit older, they tell me it's not my job to be moving those big sticks. It's my job to show other people how to do it. But still, it's pretty fun to get a big stick rolling. It's helpful. There's Kathy in the back and Babette on the left, and the four young punks in the foreground. They're the ones who are really moving it. But all of those kids have had their lives changed. You know, they were the four in the front were out there for the whole summer working for the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church Foundation as part of their training program. And it's just a great experience for us. And it's great to be out there. But we really need pros too. It's not just, we can't just do it with volunteers. You know, it's hard to run a pack string. You got to know what you're doing, and to have these big groups, it's really helpful to have a packer bring in a whole crew. But it's also really, really helpful to have young, strong backs. These three kids, they had their lives changed. But if we don't have pros, we're going to have this kind of thing where this bridge, Bear Creek Bridge, the Emil and Penny rebuilt, was closed for more than 2 years because it took them that long to scrape together the money and to find a crew that could do the work that just the two of them did. The two of them did it. They needed a whole crew to go in there and rebuild it, and it was a scramble to get the money. So it's really important for us to support this work, and for us to appreciate this work, and for us to recruit these young people to do it. All three of these people are still doing it. The two who are pulling the saw are both working for nonprofit organizations, Brad Brooks and Eric Melson. Now they're out of their 20s. This was in 2009, the very first week-long project that the Selway Bitterroot Foundation did. John Benninger is still packing in groups every year. He's a volunteer. He's got his own string. He's a pro. He does unpaid pro, but he's really good. He's one of the rare ones who's willing to really dedicate themselves. But here it is. They're still doing it. And it's really different for them. It's really different for us to have these people who are continuing to be skilled. So this is really the story that brings us to today. And Emil and Penny Keck, Bill Wharf, Bud Moore, Warren Miller all did the work. We all need to figure out ways to continue to support it so we can open up these trails and so people can experience their wilderness and see the land and appreciate that, yeah, we have fire and there's a lot of trees that fall over, but that's the story. That's what happens in wilderness. So the point at the end is that it's up to us. If people care, we'll always have wilderness. If people don't care, we won't. These are the folks who helped me out with the photos of this slideshow and in the book. Here's the book, Warren again, and you notice he's got a Sierra Club cup. You can get the book from my publisher, Caxton Press. You can get it at Powell's Book, preferred place for me. Local bookstores can get it through distributors. Amazon, you got to go with Amazon. It's the landscape. It's really worth preserving in my mind. And it's a funny deal where we have bridges, we have trails. And these bridges in some ways are a big intrusion, but you're not getting across the Selway River without a bridge. 3 Links again. This is the end of the story. This was really the story for me, seeing Emil and Penny rebuild this bridge, the two of them. 3 years, replaced every stick of wood. The largest structure in the wilderness at the time. There may be one bigger now that we've had more wildernesses added, including the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness. But at the time, it was the largest structure in the wilderness. And they rebuilt the whole thing, just the two of them. So that's my story.
Wow.
Part of it. And
John, that's fantastic. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm really happy to talk for as long as folks want to, and I realize it's a kind of an odd system, but comments or questions or anything from the folks out there, responses to anything. Do we get some questions or are people just listening?
No, there's a few questions. I've got one here from someone that said they ran into barbed wire in the wilderness and is wondering if there's much of that left in places, like the Selway Bitterroot or the Bob. I can say that in the Bob, there's still some of the phone wire to be dealt with. So some of the wire is out there to be removed and a project for the future. But John, do you still see much barbed wire in these places? And
well, it depends on where you are. Here in the Selway, it was never grazed a lot. And it was grazed in the early days when the homesteads were in there. So there was never a lot of wire run. Down in the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness, there is still quite a bit of barbed wire. In the Owyhee Wilderness that I worked on to get it designated, there's a ton of barbed wire. And there's still a lot of cows in the Owyhee Wilderness. That was compromise back in 1964 that hasn't been changed. That livestock grazing is still allowed in the wilderness. So some of those fences, like in the Owyees, it's open sagebrush country. They're going to be there, even though they cowboy the country. They run cows from horse. There's still going to be barbed wire, although there's a lot to be rolled up. And that's one of the projects that I've worked on as a volunteer, where we've rolled wire, and it's pretty satisfying actually to roll up wire and then have somebody come in and pack it out. I think all of the it's hard to find any number 9 wire, but in the Selway, but you can still find. I was out there with my granddaughter 2 years ago, and she said, "Look, there's one of those insulators Opa talks about." It's pretty cool. She spotted
there was a great story, and there is a great story in John Fraley's book, Heroes of the Bob, sadly about a moose getting its antlers tangled in some of the old telephone wire. It had a happy ending in the end, but good reason to get those old wires out of there. And back to Gibson's question about the fencing, I know in the state of Nevada, there's a whole lot of work to get fencing out of designated wilderness areas, leftover grazing allotments that are inside wilderness areas, and groups like Friends of Nevada Wilderness are leading the charge on doing work like that. I have a question.
Just
go ahead, John.
When we did the Owyhee Wilderness, was designated in 2009, we had a provision in there that any willing grazer could sell his, I mean, you can't sell a grazing permit, but you can, it's a weird deal, but you could sell the AUMs and retire the grazing. And we've done that, and we're working on doing it more, but we've done it on a couple 100,000 acres in the Owahis. And I think that, that's a model for wilderness in the sagebrush country where there's still grazing, that it's not real viable in a lot of those places for the ranchers, and be able to give them a way to get out and move someplace else is really a good investment in the long run.
So John, Tom asked, why did Emil and Penny do the bridge work in the winter?
They worked all year round, and there was nobody to bother them. But these towers here were all flown in. But in other places, they cut the logs on site, and then Emil would set up a series of pulleys and blocking tackles, and they'd skid the logs in the winter on the ice so that they wouldn't scare up the land. This bridge site, he had giant gin poles here, which he cut local, and you can't see anything of the work site from when he worked there, except for his little tent pad over to the left. There was a little tiny tent pad in the trees that you couldn't see from when you were walking along the river. His whole idea was to be out there when it was least intrusive, when he wasn't bothering anybody. He did use power tools occasionally for certain things. He mostly used hand winches, but for some of the precision cutting that he wanted to do, he used power tools, and he didn't want to be out there when people were around. But he also he wanted to be out in these little dinky wall tents through the winter. And that's just the way he was. And Penny was willing to do it. I mean, Penny's line was, you're not going to, if I ever marry you, you're not going to leave me back around at the ranger station baking cookies. I'm going to be out there with you. And there they were, the two of them. And so, I mean, it was both philosophy of personal, but also there was just that was the way to do the work in Emil's mind. His whole thing was leave no trace, boy. I mean, he was the original no trace man.
That's great.
Just leave the saw cuts.
So Terry asked John, when did they start floating the sellway as the Forest Service? When did that start happening? Do you know?
Boy, I know after it was Wilderness, they came up with the one launch a day system on the sellway. But when people started floating it, I don't know. I mean, it was sometime. Dick Walker was there at the ranger station, was there on the district in the late 60s when they started doing the reservation system, and they intentionally said one launch a day. And it stayed, and it's been very controversial. A lot of people want to see it expanded, but it's still just one launch a day. There's 4 outfitters still, and they get, I think, 4 trips each. It's such a limited season, and then they get just one launch, and then the next day will be a private. And so on that system, you don't see anybody. I had the good fortune to float it, I think it was 4 years ago, and you don't see anybody the whole time you're floating, because it's just one launch a day. But when I know, so yeah, it was after the Wilderness came in that they actually started the one launch a day system. But when people first floated, I'm really not sure. But people talked about, I've met people when I'll be telling stories about Emil and Penny, and they first replaced they tore out everything apart, and then they replaced the needle beams which hold up the decking, and they'd be out there in the summertime, in the heat of the summer, because this project was so big that they worked it all year round, and people would come floating by and see these people up there walking on this like catwalk and carrying tools, and they'd float by and they'd stop and they go see these people. And then there were these people that were out there, and I've talked to several people who've been out there. We couldn't believe it. These 2 people are out there tearing this thing apart and walking across like they were tightrope walkers.
Yeah. So there's a question about decommissioned trails in the Bob. I'm sure there's some of those also in the Selway, but as well. And if those were old trails put in by hunters or packers, you know, I'm curious to hear your answer on that. The trails end up on the ground for a lot of reasons, and they also end up getting decommissioned for a lot of reasons. Some unofficial trails become official trails, and then later some official trails become decommissioned and therefore trails. Are there a lot of examples of that in the Selway? There are certainly a few examples of that in the Bob.
Well, a lot of the trails were put in to go the shortest distance between 2 points to go up to the lookouts in particular. And they weren't put in, they were put in fast and meant to go fast. And so there weren't a lot of switchbacks and they weren't well designed. The Selway gets 35 inches of rain. So a lot of trails had to be rebuilt. And then it was really difficult. So that happened while I was there. The heavy maintenance crew was rebuilding trails, putting in switchbacks. But then they haven't been able to keep pace with the maintenance demands. So trails haven't so much been decommissioned as just grown over and gotten logged in. And with the amount of rain, there's a lot of trees, there's a lot of brush. Trails get brushed in pretty quick here.
That's a great segue to another question, which is this has motivated a few people. And yes, the trips for the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation just went live this week. So if this has motivated you to get out on the ground to help brush a trail, to help cut some trees that have fallen across the trail, to maybe help us deal with some noxious weeds in the Bob, those trips are now live, and you can start signing up for those if you go to bmwf.org. Gordon Ash wants to make sure that we give a shout out to another legendary wilderness ranger, Dick Cool, who worked out of Moose Creek. Do you know Dick, John?
Dick Cool was the lead packer in that picture with Dale Swee where they're heading across up beyond Isaac Lake in the north side of the district. Yeah, Dick Cool was the quintessential wilderness ranger, the 50-mile hiker a day. He was the guy who'd come up behind a pack string on foot and say, "Get these damn stock out of the way. The guy's got to make some time." And he'd pass him. Our Cool was such a great character. He passed away in I think it was 2019, March, age 80. We lost Dick. He was so funny. He was a crazy guy from New Jersey. And man, he could hike. Yeah, thanks, Gordon. Good tip. Our Cool.
So there's a question from John about, do you worry about future political or popular support for the wilderness?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, man. I don't know. I mean, I was just in the Boulder White Cloud Wilderness over the weekend skiing, and it just gets harder and harder to designate wilderness. It gets harder and harder to get support for wilderness. And it's not because people don't care. It's just because the people who don't like wilderness and the people who are heavily motorized just seem to be expanding and eating up land. And so the wilderness, protecting the wilderness and keeping the motors at bay is a big challenge. And now the mountain bikers, the Boulder White Clouds, the mountain bikers were hugely controversial. In the Owyhees, it was all those ATVs, side-by-sides, motorcycles, all that stuff. And, even for all these people with their 5-acre ranchettes, there's not enough packers out there who can haul tools and can haul gear and really get out there in the deep into the wilderness to be able to appreciate a, real distant hunt. And I mean, I don't know what it's like your way over in the Bob, but in our way, we have this big wilderness, the Selway and the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness. To get way in there, especially to do work way in there, you need a packer.
But all of our trips are pack supported and would not be possible if not for an amazing volunteer packing community for us. It's upwards of 80 one-way trips a year that we depend on these packers. Almost every one of our trips, we have to depend on these packers, and they're an amazing group of people. It's a community that's not growing. That's the way I'll put it. There's not a whole lot of new packers coming into the world, and our work really depends on it. And we're working to address it on our end. Certainly, a lot of fantastic packers around the bog because there's a lot of, like you said, packing for hunting and other reasons, but a lot of folks who volunteer the time for us to make it possible for our volunteer trips to go. So certainly another one of those skills, like the crosscut saw skills, that sort of just scream the wilderness idea to us, right? So
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear you're doing okay. We're struggling, I'd say. I'd say, I mean, because I've stayed really close with Idaho Trails Association, and I'd say we're struggling to get the kind of pack support we need. And I mean, it's a great skill and it's a great experience. And you know, those of us who, I've never been, I would say, really good at it, but I really appreciate the people who are, and I really encourage seeing more people be involved. But yeah, I mean, that I'm optimistic in my good days that because it's, you know, I see young people out there backpacking all the time, and we see the young people on these crews all the time, and it just works. You know, you get them out there and doing hard work and being around the campfire in the evenings and sharing stories and seeing the land and hearing the wolves howl and being out here. You know, I mean, one of the things that I think is fascinating is that we've had grizzly bears come back. You know, we're getting some grizzly bears come into the Selway. We've had 2, and that's pretty exciting.
yeah,
And there was a big political fight over it in the 90s, and we lost getting bears reintroduced. But now they're coming back on their own, and that's just another symbol of wilderness. And I think people generally are going to be there, but it's a struggle. It's a struggle.
yeah. It's so great to hear you tell these stories of so many legends, but there's legends being made today, right? That's what's so exciting to me. The Emils and Pennies of the world are frankly, you know, they're working at Moose Creek today. They're working at Big Prairie and the Bob. They're working for the Forest Service at Spotted Bear, at the Rocky Mountain Ranger District. They're working for the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation. I say not so humbly. There are some folks that really inspire me that our future is in good shape. Are there threats to the wilderness idea? Absolutely. But John, I just want to give thanks from me, and I want to turn it back over to Chell to sort of wrap up the evening, and I'll be back right at the very end.
So John, thank you so much for keeping those icons alive from our history. It was really heartwarming to hear the stories. And I need to tell you that as far as I'm concerned, you're one of them. So just briefly to end up here, we have a really talented, generous member of our Lookout Association. His name is Tom Roberts. He's an artist, and I gave him a couple photos that you had sent me from the book to use for publicity. And he very kindly, I hope you'll be able to see this, painted a painting that sort of shows the bridge and shows you with the crosscut saw on your shoulder. And when we are done here, at some point, if you'll send me your mailing address, I'll get that painting shipped off to you this week. And as Bud would say, you can hang it in your cabin.
Wow.
Thank you, John.
Very cool. Thank you. Thank you.
We're really glad to do it.
Yeah, and include the fellow's address and stuff.
I certainly will.
Very cool. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you for sharing with us. Bill, I have nothing more tonight.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us. We have our April edition of the Wilderness Speaker Series, hosted by the Flathead-Kootenai chapter of the Montana Wilderness Association. If you are like me and you are fascinated by owls, then you should definitely want to join us Wednesday night, April 7th, same time, 7 p.m. You can register for that, I believe, at MWA's website. If you want to watch this tonight, again from tonight, or share it with others, it will be available on both the Northwest Montana Lookout Association's website and on ours at the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Hope you enjoyed it. We certainly enjoyed having you join us. And John, thank you so much. And it's been great to work with you again, even if it was just for a brief hour.
Even if it's distant. Thank you all. Yeah,
Thanks.
See
Thanks,
ya.
everybody. Good night.